The Night of the Great Season by Bruno Schulz. Everyone knows that in a run of normal, uneventful years, that great eccentric, time, begets sometimes other years, different prodigal years which, like a sixth smallest toe, grow a 13th freak month. We use the word freak deliberately, because the 13th month only rarely reaches maturity, and like a child conceived late in its mother's life, it lags behind in growth. It is a hunchback month, a half-witted shoot, more tentative than real. What is at fault is the senile intemperance of the summer, its lustful and belated spurt of vitality. It sometimes happens that August has passed, and yet the old thick trunk of summer continues by force of habit to produce, and from its moldered wood grows those crab-like weed days, sterile and stupid, added as an afterthought, stunted, empty, useless days, white days, permanently astonished and quite unnecessary. They sprout, irregular and uneven, formless and joined, like the fingers of a monster's hand, stumps folded into a fist. There are people who liken these days to an apocrypha, put secretly between the chapters of the great book of the year, to palimpsests covertly included between its pages, to those white, unprinted sheets on which eyes replete with reading and the remembered shapes of words can imagine colors and pictures, which gradually become paler and paler from the blankness of the pages, or can rest on their neutrality before continuing the quest for new adventures in new chapters. Ah, that old yellowed romance of the year, that large, crumbling book of the calendar. It lies forgotten, somewhere in the archives of time, and its content continues to increase between the boards, swelling incessantly from the garrulity of months, from the quick self-perpetuation of lies, of drivel, and of dreams which multiply in it. When writing down these tales, revising the stories about my father on the used margins of its text, don't I, too, surrender to the secret hope that they will merge imperceptibly with the yellowing pages of that most splendid moldering book, that they will sink into the gentle rustle of its pages and become absorbed there? The events I am now going to relate happened in that 13th supernumerary freak month of that year, on those blank pages of the great chronicles of the calendar. The mornings were strangely refreshing and tart. From the quieted and cooler flow of time, from the completely new smell in the air, from the different consistency of the light, one could recognize that one had entered a new series of days, a new era of the Lord's year. Voices trembled under these new skies resonantly and lightly, as in a new and still empty house which smells of varnish and paint, of things begun and not yet used. With a strange emotion, one tried out new echoes. One bit into them with curiosity as, on a cool and sober morning on the eve of a journey, one bites into a fresh, still warm, currant loaf. My father was again sitting at the back of his shop, in a small, low room divided like a beehive into many cells of file boxes, from which endless layers of paper, letters, and invoices overflowed. From the rustle of sheets, from the ceaseless turning over of pages, arose the squared, empty existence of that room. The constant moving of files of innumerable letters, with business headings, created in the stuffy air an apotheosis, a bird's-eye mirage of an industrial city, bristling with smoky chimneys, surrounded by a row of metals, and with a clasp formed from the curves and flourishes of a proud end company. There my father would sit, as if in an aviary, on a high stool, and the lofts of filing cabinets rustled with piles of paper, and all the pigeonholes filled with a twitter of figures. The depth of the large shop became, from day to day, darker and richer, with stocks of cloth, serge, velvet, and cord. On the somber shelves, those granaries and silos, the cool, felted fabrics matured and yielded interest. The powerful capital of autumn multiplied and mellowed. It grew and ripened and spread, ever wider until the shelves resembled the rows of some great amphitheater. It was augmented daily by new loads of goods brought in crates and bales in the cool of the morning, on the broad, bear-like shoulders of groaning, bearded porters, who exuded an aura of autumn freshness mixed with vodka. The shop assistants unpacked these new supplies and filled with their rich drapery colors, as with putty, all the holes and cracks of the tall cupboards. They ran the gamut of all the autumn shades and went up and down through the octaves of color. Beginning at the bottom, they tried shyly and plaintively the contralto semitones, passed on to the washed-out grays of distance, to tapestry blues, and, going upward in ever broader chords, reached deep royal blues, the indigo of distant forests, and the plush of rustling parks, in order to enter through the ochres, reds, tans, and sepias, the whispering shadows of wilting gardens, and to reach finally the dark smell of fungi, the waft of mold in the depth of autumn nights, and the dull accompaniment of the darkest basses. My father walked along these arsenals of autumn goods and calmed and soothed the rising force of these masses of cloth, the power of the season. He wanted to keep intact for as long as possible those reserves of stored color. He was afraid to break into that iron fund of autumn, to change it into cash. Yet at the same time, he knew and felt that soon an autumn wind would come, a devastating wind which would blow through the cupboards, that they would give way, that nothing would check the flood, and that the streams of color would engulf the whole city. The time of the great season was approaching. The streets were getting busy. At 6 in the evening, the people became feverish, the houses stood flushed, and people walked about made up in bright colors, illuminated by some interior fire, their eyes shining with a festive fever, beautiful yet evil. In the side streets, in quiet backwaters fleeing into the night, the city was empty. Only children were out under the balconies of the small squares, playing breathlessly, noisily, and nonsensically. They put small balloons to their lips and filled them with air in order to transform themselves into red and crowing cockerels, colored autumnal masks fantastic and absurd. It seemed that, thus swollen and crowing, they would begin to float in the air, in long colored chains, and fly over the city like migrating birds, fantastic flotillas of tissue paper and autumn weather. Or else they pushed one another on small clattering carts which played tunes with their little rattling wheels, axles, and shafts. Filled with their happy cries, the carts rolled down the street to the broadly spreading evening yellow river, where they disintegrated into a jumble of discs, pegs, and sticks. And while the children's games became increasingly noisier and more complicated, while the city's flushes darkened into purple, the whole world suddenly began to wilt and blacken, and exude an uncertain dusk which contaminated everything. Treacherous and poisonous, the plague of dusk spread, passed from one object to another, and everything it touched became black and rotten and scattered into dust. People fled before it in silent panic, but the disease always caught up with them, and spread in a dark rash on their foreheads. Their faces disappeared under large, shapeless spots. They continued on their way, now featureless, without eyes, shedding as they walked one mask after another, so that the dusk became filled with the discarded larvae dropped in their flight. Then a black, rotting bark began to cover everything, in large, putrid scabs of darkness. And while down below everything disintegrated and changed into nothingness, in that silent panic of quick dissolution, above there grew and endured the alarum of sunset, vibrating with the tinkling of a million tiny bells set in motion by the rise of a million unseen larks flying together into the enormous silvery infinite. Then, suddenly, night came, a vast night, growing vaster from the pressure of great gusts of wind. In its multiple labyrinths, nests of brightness were hewn, the shops, large colored lanterns filled with goods and the bustle of customers. Through the bright glass of these lanterns, the noisy and strangely ceremonial rites of autumn shopping could be observed. The great undulating autumn night, with the shadows rising in it and the winds broadening it, hid in its folds pockets of brightness, the motley wares of street traders, chocolates, biscuits, exotic sweets, Their kiosks and barrows, made from empty boxes, papered with advertisements, full of soap, of gay trash, of gilded nothings, of tinfoil, trumpets, wafers, and colored mints, were stations of lightheartedness, outposts of gaiety, scattered on the hangings of the enormous, labyrinthine, wind-shaken night. The dense crowd sailed in darkness, in loud confusion, with the shuffle of 1,000 feet, in the chatter of 1,000 mouths, a disorderly and tangled migration proceeding along the arteries of the autumnal city. Thus flowed that river, full of noise, of dark looks, of sly winks, intersected by conversations, chopped up by laughter, an enormous babble of gossip, tumult, and chatter. It seemed as if a mob of dry poppy heads scattering their seeds, rattleheads, was on the march. My father, his cheeks flushed, his eyes shining, walked up and down his festively lit shop, excited, listening intently. Through the glass panes of the shop window and of the door, the distant hubbub of the city, the drone of wandering crowds, could be heard. Above the stillness of the shop, an oil lamp hung from the high ceiling, expelling the shadows from all the remote nooks and crannies. The empty floor cracked in the silence, and added up in the light, crosswise and lengthwise, its shining parquet squares. The large tiles of this chessboard talked to each other in tiny, dry crackles, and answered here and there with a louder knock. The pieces of cloth lay quiet and still in their felty fluffiness and exchanged looks along the walls behind my father's back, passing silent signs of agreement from cupboard to cupboard. Father was listening. In the silence of the night, his ear seemed to grow larger and to reach out beyond the window, a fantastic coral, a red polypus watching the chaos of the night. He listened and heard with growing anxiety the distant tide of the approaching crowds. Fearfully, he looked around the empty shop, searching for his assistants. Unfortunately, those dark and red-haired administering angels had flown away somewhere. Father was alone, terrified of the crowd which was soon to flood the calm of the shop in a plundering, noisy mob, to divide among themselves and put up to auction the whole rich autumn which he had collected over the years and stored in his large, secluded silo. Where were the shop assistants? Where were those handsome cherubs who had been entrusted with the defense of the dark bastions of cloth? My father thought with painful suspicion that perhaps they were somewhere in the depths of the building, with other men's daughters. Standing immobile and anxious, his eyes shining in the lamplit silence of the shop, he heard with his inner ear what was happening inside the house, in the back chambers of that large colored lantern. The house opened before him, room after room, chamber after chamber, like a house of cards, and he saw the shop assistants chasing Adela through all the empty, brightly lit rooms, upstairs and downstairs, until she escaped them and reached the kitchen to barricade herself there behind the kitchen dresser. There Adela stood, panting, amused, smiling to herself, her long lashes fluttering. The shop assistants were giggling, crouched behind the door. The kitchen window was open onto the black night, saturated with dreams and complications. The dark, half-opened panes shone with the reflections of a distant illumination. The gleaming saucepans and jars stood immobile on all sides and glinted with their thick glaze. Adela leaned cautiously from the window, her brightly made-up face with the fluttering eyes. She looked for the shop assistants in the dark courtyard, sensing an ambush. And then she saw them, advancing slowly and carefully toward her in single file, along the narrow ledge under the window which ran the length of the wall, now red from the glare of distant lights. My father shouted in anger and desperation, but at that very moment the hubbub of voices grew much nearer, and the shop window became peopled with faces crooked with laughter, with chattering mouths, with noses flattened on the shining panes. My father grew purple with anger and jumped on the counter, and while the crowd stormed his fortress and entered his shop in a noisy mass, father, in one leap, reached the shelves of fabric, and, hanging high above the crowd, began to blow with all his strength a large shofar, sounding the alert. But the ceiling did not resound with the rustle of angels' wings speeding to his rescue. Instead, each plaint of the shofar was answered by the loud, sneering choir of the crowd. "Jacob, start trading! Jacob, start selling!" they called, and the chant, repeated over and over again, became rhythmical, transforming itself into the melody of a chorus, sung by them all. My father saw that resistance would be useless, jumped down from his ledge, and moved with a shout toward the barricades of cloth. Grown tall with fury, his head swollen into a purple fist, he rushed like a fighting prophet on the ramparts of cloth, and began to storm against them. He leaned his whole strength against the enormous bales, heaving them from their places. He put his shoulders under the great lengths of cloth, and made them fall on the counter with a dull thud. The bales overturned, unfolding in the air like enormous flags. The shelves exploded with bursts of draperies, with waterfalls of fabrics, as if touched by the wand of Moses. The reserves from the cupboard poured out and flowed in a broad, relentless stream. The colorful contents of the shelves spread and multiplied, covering all the counters and tables. The walls of the shop disappeared under the powerful formations of that cosmogony of cloth, under its mountain ranges that rose in imposing massifs. Wide valleys opened up between the slopes, and lines of continents loomed up from the pathos of broad plains. The interior of the shop formed itself into the panorama of an autumn landscape, full of lakes and distance. Against that backdrop, my father wandered among the folds and valleys of a fantastic Canaan. He strode about, his hands spread out prophetically to touch the clouds, and shaped the land with strokes of inspiration. And down below, at the bottom of that Sinai which rose from my father's anger, stood the gesticulating crowd, cursing, worshipping Baal, and bargaining. They dipped their hands into the soft folds of fabric. They draped themselves into colored cloth. They wrapped improvised cloaks around themselves and talked incoherently and without cease. My father would suddenly appear over a group of customers, increased in stature by his anger, to thunder against the idolaters with great and powerful words. Then, driven to despair, he would climb again on the high galleries of the cupboards and run crazily along the ledges and shelves, on the resounding boards of the bare scaffolding, pursued by visions of the shameless lust which, he felt, was being given full rein behind his back. The shop assistants had just reached the iron balcony, level with the window, and, clinging to the railings, they grabbed Adela by the waist and pulled her away from the window. She still fluttered her eyelids and dragged her slim, silk-stockinged legs behind her. When my father, horrified by the hideousness of sin, merged his angry gestures with the awe-inspiring landscape, the carefree worshippers of Baal below him gave themselves up to unbridled mirth. An epidemic of laughter took hold of that mob. How could one expect seriousness from that race of rattles and nutcrackers? How could one demand understanding for my father's stupendous worries from these windmills, incessantly grinding words to a colored pulp? Deaf to the thunder of father's prophetic wrath, those traders in silk caftans crouched in small groups around the piles of folded material, gaily discussing, amid bursts of laughter, the qualities of the goods. These black-clad merchants with their rapid tongues obscured the noble essence of the landscape, diminished it by the hash of words, almost engulfed it. In other places, in front of the waterfalls of light fabrics, stood groups of Jews in colored gabardines and tall fur hats. These were the gentlemen of the great congregation, distinguished and solemn men, stroking their long, well-groomed beards and holding sober and diplomatic discourse. But even in those ceremonial conversations, in the looks which they exchanged, glimmers of smiling irony could be detected. Around these groups milled the common crowd, a shapeless mob without face or individuality. It somehow filled the gaps in the landscape. It littered the background with the bells and rattles of its thoughtless chatter. These were the jesters, the dancing crowd of harlequins and pulcinellas who, without any serious business intentions themselves, made by their clownish tricks a mockery of the negotiations starting here and there. Gradually, however, tired of jokes, this merry mob scattered to the farthest points of the landscape, and there slowly lost itself among the rocky crags and valleys. Probably one by one those gestures sank into the cracks and folds of the terrain, like children tired of playing, who disappear during a party into the corners and back rooms of the festive house. Meanwhile, the fathers of the city, members of the great Sanhedrin, walked up and down in dignified and serious groups, and led earnest discussion in undertones. Having spread themselves over the whole extensive mountain country, they wandered in twos and threes on distant and circuitous roads. Their short, dark silhouettes peopled the desert plateau over which hung a dark and heavy sky, full of clouds, cut into long parallel furrows, into silvery white streaks, showing in its depth ever more distant strata of air. The lamplight created an artificial day in that region, a strange day, a day without dawn or dusk. My father slowly quieted down. His anger composed itself and cooled under the calming influence of the landscape. He was now sitting in a gallery of high shelves and looking at the vast autumnal country. He saw people fishing in distant lakes. In their tiny shell-like boats, fishermen, two to a boat, dipped their nets in the water. On the banks, boys were carrying on their heads baskets full of flapping silvery catches. And then he noticed that groups of wanderers in the distance were lifting their faces to the sky, pointing to something with upraised hands. And soon the sky came out in a colored rash, in blotches which grew and spread, and was filled with a strange tribe of birds, circling and revolving in great crisscrossing spirals. Their lofty flight, the movement of their wings, formed majestic scrolls that filled the silent sky. Some of them, enormous storks, floated almost immobile on calmly spread wings. Others, resembling colored plumes or barbarous trophies, had to flap their wings heavily and clumsily to maintain height upon the current of warm air. Still others, formless conglomerations of wings, of powerful legs and bare necks, were like badly stuffed vultures and condors from which the sawdust was spilling. There were among them two-headed birds and birds with many wings. There were cripples, too, limping through the air in one-winged, awkward flight. The sky now resembled those in old murals, full of monsters and fantastic beasts, which circled around, passing and eluding each other in elliptical maneuvers. My father rose on his perch and, in a sudden glare of light, stretched out his hands, summoning the birds with an old incantation. He recognized them with deep emotion. They were the distant, forgotten progeny of that generation of birds which at one time Adela had chased away to all 4 points of the sky. That brood of freaks, that malformed, wasted tribe of birds, was now returning degenerated or overgrown. Nonsensically large, stupidly developed, the birds were empty and lifeless inside. All their vitality went into their plumage, into external adornment. They were like exhibits of extinct species in a museum, the lumber room of a bird's paradise. Some of them were flying on their backs, had heavy misshapen beaks like padlocks, were blind, or were covered with curiously colored lumps. How moved my father was by this unexpected return. How he marveled at the instinct of these birds, at their attachment to the master, whom that expelled tribe had preserved in their soul like a legend, in order to return to their ancient motherland after numerous generations, on the last day before the extinction of the tribe. But these blind birds made of paper could not recognize my father. In vain did he call them with the old formulas. In the forgotten language of the birds, they did not hear him, nor see him. All of a sudden, stones began to whistle through the air. The merrymakers, the stupid, thoughtless people had begun to throw them into the fantastic bird-filled sky. In vain did father warn them. In vain did he entreat them with magical gestures. He was not heard nor heeded. Hit by stones, they hung heavily and waited while still in the air. Even before they crashed to the ground, they were a formless heap of feathers. Before my father could reach the place of slaughter, the once splendid birds were dead, scattered all over the rocks. Only now, from nearby, did father notice the wretchedness of that wasted generation, the nonsense of its second-rate anatomy. They had been nothing but enormous bunches of feathers, stuffed carelessly with old carrion. In many of them one could not recognize where their heads had been, for that misshapen part of their bodies was unmarked by the presence of a soul. Some were covered with a curly matted fur like bison, and stank horribly. Others reminded one of hunchback, bald, dead camels. Others still must have been made of a kind of cardboard, empty inside but splendidly colored on the outside. Some of them proved at close quarters to be nothing more than large peacocks' tails, colorful fans into which, by some obscure process, a semblance of life had been breathed. I saw my father's unhappy return. The artificial day became slowly tinted with the colors of an ordinary morning. In the deserted shop, the highest shelves were bathed in the reflections of the morning sky. Amid the fragments of the extinct landscape, among the ruined background scenery of the night, Father saw his shop assistants awakening from sleep. They rose from among the bales of cloth and yawned toward the sun. In the kitchen, on the floor above, Adela, warm from sleep and with unkempt hair, was grinding coffee in a mill which she pressed to her white bosom, imparting her warmth to the broken beans. The cat was washing itself in the sunlight.